Let's get started. Story number 1.
I moved into the old house on Hawthorne Street in late summer. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet if you asked me, and the house itself had been on the market for a while. It was an estate sale, so I knew there had to be a reason it hadn't sold quickly. Still, I was drawn to the place. The price was right, and the bones of the house had a certain charm. It was one of those old Victorian-style homes with high ceilings, a grand staircase, and big windows that let in plenty of natural light. The yard was overgrown, the paint was peeling, and the floors creaked with every step. But I liked the character. It felt like a project, and I was ready for one. I moved in alone. My friends were all busy with their own lives, and I had been living with roommates for too long. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I preferred it. The idea of having the entire space to myself to do what I wanted was exhilarating. But there was an undercurrent of something in the air from the moment I first stepped inside. The house smelled old. There was a thick, musty scent of dust and stale wood. It was the kind of smell that made you want to open all the windows and let in the fresh air, but no matter how many windows I opened, the smell lingered. It sat in the corners of every room, as if the house itself was holding on to its past. The first few nights weren't too bad. I'd stayed up late unpacking boxes, organizing my things, and exploring the house. The kitchen was large, the cabinets ancient but sturdy, and the living room had a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The upstairs was a maze of rooms, each with its own oddities. The master bedroom was at the front of the house, with a big bay window that overlooked the street. I remember standing there the first night, watching the dim glow of streetlights and listening to the sounds of distant traffic. It was peaceful, but something about the view unsettled me. I couldn't quite put my finger on why. As the days passed, I started to get accustomed to the house. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, or so I thought. The first thing that threw me off was the staircase. Every time I descended it, I felt this weird sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I tried to brush it off as a trick of the mind, but it happened every time. The stairs were narrow, creaky, and had this odd unevenness to them, almost like they were too steep. I didn't like walking down them in the dark, but I always had to at least once each night to grab something from the kitchen or to use the bathroom. It was on the third night that things started to get strange. I had just returned from the grocery store and was putting the bags down on the kitchen counter when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps from upstairs. Heavy, slow footsteps, almost like someone was pacing. I froze, a chill running up my spine. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I hadn't heard anyone come in. My heart began to race as I stood there, staring up at the staircase. The footsteps continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. Then I heard a faint tapping sound, like fingernails lightly tapping against the floor. I stood there, listening, holding my breath. Finally, I gathered the courage to move. I walked cautiously up the stairs, my footsteps loud against the creaky wood. I reached the top of the stairs and stood still, listening for any sounds. Nothing. Just the usual silence of the house. I checked the rooms. The guest room was empty, the bathroom was unused, and the master bedroom door was shut. But nothing seemed out of place. I didn't know what I had expected to find, but the silence only made me feel worse. The next day, I decided to call a friend over for dinner, hoping to shake the feeling of unease. I invited Claire, someone I had known for years. She was a good friend, and she always seemed to know how to lighten the mood. She arrived around 6, and we spent the evening chatting over takeout and wine, laughing about old memories. As the night wore on, I felt a little more at ease, but the moment Claire decided to leave, I felt it again, the same unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. I walked her to the door, and when I turned back to the living room, I saw something that made my heart stop. The hallway light was flickering. I hadn't touched the light switch in hours. The bulb had been fine when Claire arrived, and now it was blinking erratically, like it was struggling to stay on. I stepped closer to the light, reaching out to flick the switch, but as soon as my hand hovered over it, the light went out completely. I froze, staring at the darkness. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate steps coming from the direction of the stairs. This time I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't chalk it up to nerves or the house settling. It sounded too real, too deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slowly made my way to the stairs. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every step I took felt like it was leading me towards something I wasn't prepared to face. The flashlight beam danced across the walls as I ascended, but the further I climbed, the colder it became. By the time I reached the landing, I could see my breath in the air, even though the house was warm downstairs. The door to the master bedroom was ajar. I hadn't left it open. I stood frozen for a long moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I wanted to turn around and leave, but my feet were glued to the floor. The footsteps stopped. The house was still. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, pushing the door open. The room was empty, but something was wrong. There was a chill in the air, colder than any place I had ever felt before. I could feel it wrapping around me like an unseen presence. Then, in the corner of the room, near the window, I saw something move. It was subtle at first, like a shadow shifting against the wall, but then it became clearer, a figure hunched and dark, standing just outside the window. It was almost too tall, too thin, and its face was completely obscured by darkness, as if the figure were swallowed by the night itself. I stepped back, but my legs wouldn't move fast enough. My body felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. I could hear a whisper, a soft rasping voice like it was speaking directly into my ear, but the words didn't make sense. They were garbled, distorted, too low to make out. The figure didn't move, but its presence felt suffocating, like it was pulling me toward it. The air became colder still, and my breath was coming out in visible puffs. My hands were shaking as I turned and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I ran down the stairs, my heart pounding, the footsteps once again echoing in the silence. I grabbed my phone, dialing Claire's number without thinking, but it went straight to voicemail. The house felt like it was closing in on me. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, watching the shadows stretch longer and longer as the hours passed. Every creak, every whisper made me jump. The cold never left. I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the dark corners of the house. The next morning, I called a local paranormal investigator. I didn't believe in ghosts, but something had happened in that house, something I couldn't explain away. The investigator, a man named Daniel, arrived a few hours later. He had a calm, methodical way about him, and he immediately began setting up his equipment, cameras, audio recorders, and temperature gauges. As we toured the house, he seemed unusually focused on the upstairs, where I had felt the most discomfort. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was taking notes on everything. The temperature changes, the odd angles of certain rooms, even the subtle sounds of the house settling. That night, after Daniel had set up his equipment, we sat in the living room, waiting. It wasn't long before the temperature dropped. Daniel checked his equipment and confirmed that the temperature had dropped by several degrees in the span of a few minutes. The air felt dense, like it was pressing in on us from every direction. Then we heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. Daniel stood up, a solemn look on his face. "We're not alone here," he said quietly. We both moved toward the stairs, and as we climbed, I heard the faintest whisper, just at the edge of my hearing. It was the same voice, distorted and garbled, like it was speaking in another language. When we reached the master bedroom, we found the door wide open. But this time, the figure wasn't there. The room was empty, and the coldness had lifted. Daniel looked around the room, his eyes narrowing. "It's here," he said softly. "Whatever it is, it doesn't want you here." We left the house that night, and I never went back. I had the house blessed, and the investigator told me he'd keep in touch, but I knew better. I didn't want to know any more about the house or its history. All I knew was that whatever haunted that place wasn't done with me, and I never found out who or what was standing in that window that night. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I used to work as a night security guard at a place called Hawthorne Memorial Hospital. It was a long-standing medical facility built in the 1920s, located just on the outskirts of a small city in New England. The kind of place that had a rich history, filled with medical breakthroughs and tragedy alike. There were always stories, ghost stories, legends of the past lingering in the halls, but when I first started, I didn't believe in that sort of thing. To me, it was all just hearsay. But that changed. I had taken the job right after graduating college, needing something steady and quiet. The hours were perfect for me, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and the pay, though not fantastic, was enough. My role was simple: patrol the floors, make sure everything was locked up tight, and ensure no patients or staff wandered into off limits areas during the night. It was a solitary job, and that suited me just fine. The hospital, though large and old, had been mostly updated and renovated over the years, with a few new wings added and some of the older sections closed off. The area where I worked was mostly administrative floors, offices, and the older parts of the building that no longer saw much use. For the first few weeks, nothing stood out. The building was quiet. Every night, I made my rounds. The smell of antiseptic and old wood was always present, and the flickering fluorescent lights in the hallways were a constant reminder of the building's age. The nurses and doctors on the late shift always greeted me with tired smiles and a wave as they passed by, but mostly I was left to do my job in peace. Then came the first incident. I was assigned to patrol the old section of the hospital that was once the original wing, now locked off and used for storage. The place was like a time capsule, with old equipment, records, and forgotten medical artifacts stashed away in dark corners. One night I was walking down the hallway on the second floor near the old patient rooms when I heard something. It was soft, barely audible over the hum of the overhead lights. At first I thought it was just the sound of the building settling, wood creaking, pipes groaning, but then it became clearer. It was a voice. It was faint, as though coming from one of the rooms ahead of me. I couldn't make out the words at first, but it sounded like a woman, maybe someone in distress. My first instinct was to check the rooms to make sure no one had somehow gotten inside. But when I reached the door to the room where I thought the voice was coming from, I found it locked. I checked the others down the hall. All locked. Still, the voice continued. It wasn't just one voice anymore. There were others, murmuring in low tones, overlapping. I stood there, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. I glanced around, convinced I was hearing things, but the voices continued, like an echo, bouncing off the old, narrow hallways. I took a step back, and the door to one of the rooms creaked open, as if someone had just unlocked it. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what to do. No one was supposed to be in here. This section of the hospital had been closed off for years. But I pushed the door open anyway, the hinges protesting with a loud screech. The room was empty. The beds were long gone, the walls bare except for peeling paint, and the smell of old, stale air hit me hard. But the thing that froze me in place was the temperature. It was freezing cold, like stepping into a freezer. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the air, before I backed out slowly and closed the door. The voices stopped. I figured it was just my imagination. Maybe I was overworked or exhausted from the long hours. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few weeks were quiet, but the odd feeling never quite left me. I started hearing the whispers again, but only in certain parts of the building. Always near the old rooms, always on the second floor. At first, it was just faint, like I was hearing things out of the corner of my mind. But then, one night, I heard something else. I was doing my usual walkthrough, checking doors and windows, when I heard a loud crash. It came from the old storage area where they kept old records and equipment. I rushed toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I rounded the corner into the storage room, my beam landed on the far wall. It took a moment for my brain to process what I was seeing. There, in front of me, was an old wooden chair. It had been tipped over, its back leaning against the wall. But that wasn't what made my heart stop. What made my blood run cold was the dark shape sitting in the chair. A figure, tall and thin, shrouded in darkness, but I could make out the shape of a person. A woman, I thought, though I couldn't see her clearly. She was sitting perfectly still, her head tilted downward. Her hair was long, dark, and hung in front of her face. I couldn't see her eyes, but I felt them on me. Just the way she was staring, I could feel it. My breath caught in my throat. The air was thick, heavy, and cold as I took a step forward, unsure of what to do. I wanted to call out, to ask if she was okay, but I couldn't find my voice. Then the woman slowly lifted her head, and my stomach lurched. Her face, there was no face. just a smooth, pale surface. No eyes, no mouth, just an empty mask of flesh. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed for me to run, but my feet wouldn't listen. And then, in a voice, I heard her say it. Help me. It wasn't like a whisper. It was a cold, empty sound, like the air itself had spoken. The hairs on my neck stood on end. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. I made it back to the security desk and sat there, shaking, my hands trembling as I tried to process what I had just seen. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But deep down I knew it wasn't. I knew what I had seen. The next morning, I found myself unable to shake the image of that woman's empty face. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. It felt like something was pulling at me, something was calling to me from that room. It wasn't until a few days later that I got the chance to speak with one of the old nurses who had worked at the hospital for decades. Her name was Margaret, and she had worked in the maternity ward before retiring. She was the kind of person who had seen everything, from happy births to tragic deaths. But when I mentioned the old wing, she went pale. "You saw her," she said, her voice low. "The woman in the chair. I thought I was the only one who had seen her. I thought it was just me." She told me the story of a young nurse who had worked in the hospital back in the late 1940s. Her name was Evelyn. She had been a dedicated, kind woman, but she had suffered a tragic fate. One night, she had been in that very section of the hospital, working late on a patient's records. Margaret had been on duty with her, but when she went to check on Evelyn, she found her lying in one of the old patient rooms. She had been found dead, her face frozen in terror, her hands clutching the edges of the bed as though something had been pulling her away. The police had never found a cause of death. No one knew what had happened to her. But some of the staff believed that Evelyn's spirit still lingered in the hospital, trapped in that room. They said she was still searching for help, still reaching out, but no one ever answered. The next night, I went back to the hospital. I couldn't get the image of her face out of my mind. I went straight to the old wing. I had to know more. When I got to the room, everything was still. The air was thick, but didn't feel cold like it had before. I stepped inside and looked around. It was just a room, old and dusty, but something was different. The feeling of being watched was gone. Then, just as I was about to leave, I saw it. A single photograph wedged between two old file folders on the desk. I took it and examined it in the dim light. It was a picture of a young nurse, Evelyn. She was smiling, standing with another nurse, both in uniform. I turned the photo over. There was a date written on the back. April 2nd, 1948. And underneath it, one word: help. I never went back after that night. I don't know if I ever will, but I can't forget what I saw, or the feeling of Evelyn's empty face staring out at me from the darkness. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I didn't believe in ghosts. Never did. I always considered myself a pragmatic person. The kind of person who, if they heard a creak in the floorboards or a door slamming in the wind, would immediately rationalize it as the house settling, the wind picking up, or something else entirely explainable. That was until I moved to that old farmhouse just outside of town. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape. I had spent years living in cramped apartments, surrounded by the noise and chaos of city life. The farmhouse was a bargain, a fixer-upper, but the price was right. The kind of place you could see yourself breathing easy in, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and nothing to do but watch the seasons change. The previous owners had long since moved out, but they'd left behind remnants of their lives. Old furniture covered in sheets, dusty portraits hanging on the walls, and boxes of items that seemed to have been left in haste. I didn't think much of it. I was just excited to start over. The house was massive, 3 stories, a wraparound porch, an attic that seemed to go on forever, and a barn that was slowly falling into disrepair. It was surrounded by dense trees, a small field, and a winding dirt road leading up to it. The kind of place that seemed like it could be right out of an old horror movie, but I didn't let that bother me. It was just a house, after all. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days cleaning, repairing what I could, and trying to make the house feel more like home. The furniture was old, but it had a charm to it. The kitchen had a large wood stove that, despite its age, worked perfectly well. The rooms were spacious, with high ceilings and windows that let in a lot of light. It was everything I had hoped for. It wasn't until the third week that I started noticing the odd things. Little things at first, like the way the temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms, no matter how much I cranked up the heat, or the way the floorboards creaked in the hallway outside my bedroom, even though I was the only one living there. I brushed it off. Old houses make noises. That's just how it goes. But then, it started getting stranger. I was sitting in the living room one evening, reading a book by the fire, when I heard something in the hallway. A faint tapping, like someone was gently knocking on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I got up and went to check. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, the only sound coming from the crackling fire in the other room. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. I told myself it was just the house settling again. No big deal. But then the tapping came again, this time louder, more insistent. I froze. It was coming from the front door. Hesitantly, I walked to the door, half expecting to find someone on the other side. But when I opened it, no one was there. Just the dark, empty porch stretching out into the night. I checked the porch for any signs of someone having been there, footprints in the dust, anything, but found nothing. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept hearing small noises, whispers almost, coming from the walls. At first, I thought it was just my imagination running wild, but the more I listened, the more distinct the voices became. Faint, low murmurs that seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the house. I didn't dare go searching for the source. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The following days were filled with more strange occurrences. Objects would be out of place when I returned home. An old photograph that I had set down on the mantel would be moved to the kitchen counter, or the kitchen chair would be pulled out as though someone had been sitting there. I asked the neighbors if they had seen anyone around, but they all said the same thing. No one had been near the house. It wasn't until a week later that I met the woman who would change everything. Her name was Agnes, and she was the daughter of the original owners of the farmhouse. She had stopped by to introduce herself and see how I was settling in. She was a kind woman in her late 60s, with silver hair and a soft voice. She had lived in the house for most of her life before moving into a nearby town with her husband. She said she had always loved the house, but had been forced to leave it behind when they could no longer keep up with the upkeep. As we sat on the porch drinking tea, I asked her if she had ever experienced anything strange in the house. I figured I might as well ask, considering everything that had been happening. She didn't answer right away, but I could see her eyes flicker with something, an emotion I couldn't quite place. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "You're not the first to hear things," she said quietly. "There have been others who stayed in that house over the years. They all say the same thing, that they heard noises, voices, footsteps, things moving when there's no one around. But it's not just the house that's the problem," she said, her voice growing softer. "It's the land. It's cursed." I laughed nervously. "Cursed? Agnes, you don't really believe that, do you?" She looked at me, her expression serious. "You don't understand. It's not just the house. There are things that happened here, things that go beyond the house itself. When my family lived here, there were events, things that were kept quiet, things we didn't talk about. But they're still here. They never left." Her words hung in the air, heavy with something I couldn't quite comprehend. I asked her to explain, but she simply shook her head and stood up. "Maybe it's better if you don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some things are better left buried." She left shortly after that, but her words stayed with me. I didn't know what she meant, but something in her eyes told me that whatever it was dark. It was powerful, and it was very much alive. That night, the tapping returned. But this time it wasn't just at the door. I could hear it throughout the entire house, knocking, tapping, scraping noises that seemed to be coming from all directions. The whispers were louder now, as if they were in the room with me, surrounding me. I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine, and I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to move. Suddenly, the door to the attic slammed open, and the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. I hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up the stairs to the attic. The door creaked open on its own as I approached. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned beneath my feet. I could feel something in the air, something dark, pressing in from all sides. As I reached the top of the stairs, my flashlight flickered and died. I tried to turn it back on, but it wouldn't work. The only sound was the beating of my heart in my chest. And then I saw it. There, in the far corner of the attic, was a figure. It was a woman, standing motionless in the shadows. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. I froze. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I felt her presence, cold, suffocating. And then, as if sensing my fear, she turned her head slowly toward me. Her grin grew wider, impossibly wide, until her face seemed to stretch with it. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. The flashlight in my hand flickered back to life just as I turned to run, illuminating the attic for a split second. But in that moment, I saw something I couldn't unsee. There were others, figures, all standing in the shadows, watching me. Silent, waiting. I didn't stay long enough to understand what was happening. I ran out of the attic, down the stairs, and out the front door. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I left that night, packed everything up, got in my car, and never returned to that farmhouse. I don't know what Agnes was talking about, and I don't care to know. All I know is that there was something in that house. Something old. Something angry. I left the keys in the mailbox and drove away, leaving the past behind. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was a cool autumn evening when I decided to stay at my uncle's cabin in the mountains of North Carolina. I had just finished graduate school and needed a break from the hustle of city life. My uncle, Henry, was the kind of man who liked his solitude. He owned a cabin deep in the woods away from the prying eyes of the world. He'd always told me that the place was his sanctuary. I figured it was a perfect opportunity for me to unwind, breathe some fresh mountain air, and spend time with family. When I arrived, the cabin looked just as I remembered from the few visits I made as a child. The wood, dark and weathered, sat nestled among the towering pines, the smoke from the chimney rising into the clear sky. My uncle greeted me at the door, his face slightly grayer than the last time I saw him. We exchanged pleasantries, and I noticed his eyes darting nervously to the woods every now and then. It wasn't until later that night that I would understand why. After dinner, we sat by the fire, my uncle sipping on his whiskey while I nursed a beer. The crackling of the flames filled the silence, and I could hear the occasional rustle of the leaves outside. It was the kind of peaceful stillness that you could only find in the woods far from civilization. "So, how's life been treating you?" my uncle asked, his voice rough, like it always was. I told him about my recent graduation, the job offers, and my attempts to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. He listened intently, offering occasional grunts of approval or advice, but his eyes kept glancing over to the window, where the dark forest stretched out beyond the cabin. There was something in the air, something unsettling about the way he looked at the trees. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to catch his gaze. He hesitated, then let out a deep breath. "There's something I need to tell you about this place, something I've never told anyone." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's going on?" He looked down at his glass, swirling the amber liquid. "This cabin, it's not just a place to get away. It's been in the family for generations. My grandfather built it, and before him, his father. But there's always been something off about it. Something I never could shake." I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "My grandfather always told me stories, said the cabin was built on land that had been cursed, land where something terrible had happened long before we ever came here. He told me that the spirits of the dead roam these woods, and that sometimes they come looking for someone to take with them." I chuckled nervously, unsure if he was joking. "Spirits? You don't really believe that, do you?" He didn't answer at first. He just stared into the fire, the flickering light casting shadows across his face. "I didn't either at first," he said quietly, "but then I started seeing things." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, seeing things?" He looked up at me, his eyes wide and serious. things in the woods. Figures. Shadows that move when there's no wind, lights that flicker in the trees at night, and voices that carry through the forest even though there's no one out there. I thought I was imagining it, but after a while I couldn't ignore it. There's something out there. The wind howled outside, causing the cabin to creak. I glanced at the window, the dense forest beyond looking almost alive, the branches swaying like they were reaching out for something. My uncle's words seemed to hang in the air like the smoke from the fire. "I've seen them," he continued. "I've heard them." I tried to laugh it off. "Okay, well, I'm sure it's just your mind playing tricks on you. Maybe you've been spending too much time out here alone." He didn't respond right away, and for a moment there was only the sound of the fire crackling and the wind outside. Then, he said, "You should know. They don't just stay in the woods. They've been inside the cabin, too." I froze. "What do you mean, inside?" "Late at night," he said in a low voice, his tone serious, "I've heard footsteps upstairs when no one's up there. I've heard whispers from the attic, and sometimes, I swear, I feel something watching me when I'm lying in bed. I thought I was just being paranoid, but after a while, I realized it wasn't in my head. Something's here." I could feel the unease in my stomach growing. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself that it was just a bunch of old stories and paranoia. But my uncle was visibly shaken, his hand gripping the glass of whiskey a little too tightly. "Don't go upstairs alone," he said suddenly, his voice almost pleading. "And whatever you do, stay away from the attic. It's worse up there." I laughed nervously again, but this time there was no humor in it. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, and I could feel it. The house, the cabin, no longer felt like a safe, comforting place. It felt like something else, something ancient and full of secrets. That night, I decided to stay in the guest room, the one on the second floor, away from the main living areas. I tried to sleep, but the air was thick with an oppressive weight. The sounds of the night, the howling wind and the rustling of the trees felt too close, too present. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something, a distant scraping sound, like fingernails on wood. I sat up in bed, listening intently, but the house was still, except for the wind. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again. A thump, soft but distinct, coming from above. I froze. The attic. I glanced at the door to the hallway, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw a shadow pass by, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the door. I opened it slowly, my feet making no sound on the old wooden floors. I crept down the hall, past the stairs that led up to the attic. The door to the attic was slightly ajar. I hadn't meant to go up there, but something pulled me toward it. Something urged me to open the door and step inside. I pushed the door open and shone my phone's flashlight toward the staircase that led up to the attic. The steps were old, covered in dust, and creaked under my weight as I ascended. The temperature dropped with each step, and I could feel the air grow thick, almost heavy with something I couldn't place. When I reached the top of the stairs, I swung the beam of the flashlight around the room. The attic was mostly empty, filled with old furniture covered in sheets, boxes of forgotten things, and forgotten memories. But in the corner near the far wall was something I didn't expect to see. A figure. It was hunched over, sitting on the floor, its back to me. It looked like a person, but not quite. The shape was too thin, too unnatural. The long, pale arms were stretched out in front of it, as if it were reaching for something. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was aware of me. I didn't move. I couldn't. My feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. The figure turned its head slowly, and I saw its eyes, dark, empty holes, black as the void, staring directly into mine. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. In that moment, I realized my uncle hadn't been lying. Whatever had been haunting this cabin, whatever was in these woods, was real, and it was not going to let me leave. I ran. I bolted down the stairs, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I slammed the door to the guest room behind me and locked it. I could still hear the scraping sound from upstairs, like fingernails on the wooden beams. I stayed in the guest room the rest of the night, unable to sleep, too afraid to move. The shadows outside the window seemed to stretch closer with every passing minute. The next morning, I packed my things quickly without speaking to my uncle. I couldn't look him in the eye. I drove out of those woods without ever looking back. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that attic. I don't know if it was a ghost or something worse, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was waiting for me, and I don't think it's ever going to stop. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I never really thought much about ghosts. As a kid, I'd been terrified of the idea, the way most children are, afraid of the dark, of things lurking under the bed, but I grew out of it. By the time I was in my 20s, I was more concerned with bills, work, and the mundane parts of adulthood. I had a good job, a nice apartment, and a steady routine. But that all changed one summer when I took a job at a small, secluded inn on the outskirts of town. The inn, known as Willowbrook, had been in business for decades, but not many people came around. It wasn't on the main road, tucked back in a quiet part of the woods, and the signage was so weathered that you could easily miss it. Most of the guests were either retirees looking for peace and quiet, or hikers passing through, staying for one night before continuing their journey. I was hired to help out with general tasks, checking in guests, cleaning rooms, and helping the owner with odd jobs when needed. The owner, Mrs. Harper, was a pleasant older woman, probably in her late 60s, with silver hair that she always kept in a neat bun. She seemed kind enough, although she was always a bit distant, as if her mind was somewhere else most of the time. She'd welcome me every morning with a warm smile and a cup of coffee, but would always leave me to my duties quickly, disappearing into the back of the inn. She rarely spoke about the history of the place, and when I asked about the rooms or the property, she would answer politely, but it was clear she didn't want to dwell on it. The inn itself had a strange charm to it, the kind that made you feel both comfortable and slightly uneasy. The creaky wooden floors, the thick, heavy curtains that blocked out most of the daylight, the musty scent of old books and furniture, it all contributed to an atmosphere that was both inviting and a little ominous. The rooms were simple but cozy, decorated with floral patterns and antique furniture that made you feel as though you'd stepped back in time. It wasn't until a few weeks into my stay that I started to notice odd things. At first, it was small stuff. Objects moving out of place, doors that would close by themselves, the faint sound of footsteps when I was alone. I thought it was just the usual quirks of an old building. The house was drafty after all, and the wind could easily make the doors creak or rattle. The house settled at night too, producing sounds that were hard to ignore. But then things started to escalate. One evening I was working the front desk when I heard a soft knocking sound coming from one of the rooms on the second floor. I went to investigate, assuming a guest had left something in their room, but when I reached the door, the sound stopped. I knocked, called out, but there was no response. After a moment, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, expecting to find an empty room. Instead, the bed was made neatly, the windows closed tight, and nothing seemed out of place. But there was a coldness to the air, an unsettling chill that didn't match the warmth of the rest of the inn. I left the room quickly, trying to shake the feeling of discomfort that had settled in my chest. I figured I just imagined the whole thing. But over the following days, I began hearing the knocking again, always coming from the same room. Sometimes it was in the middle of the night, and other times it was during the day when the inn was empty. Each time I'd go to the room, find it empty, and feel that strange coldness in the air. The guests never mentioned anything unusual, but I started to feel the unease creeping in. It was hard to ignore the feeling that someone or something was watching me, especially when I was in the hallways or walking through the common areas late at night. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the silence of the inn was playing tricks on me. But the more I tried to push it out of my mind, the more persistent the feelings became. Things only grew stranger when Mrs. Harper asked me to take a room off the schedule for the week. She didn't tell me why, just that she didn't want anyone to book it. I tried to ask more about it, but she simply smiled and said it was a private matter. I couldn't help but be curious. Why would she single out that particular room? One evening, after Mrs. Harper had gone to bed, I found myself walking down the hall to that room. The door was shut tightly, just as it always was, but something about it felt different that night. I could hear the wind picking up outside, the branches of the trees scraping against the windows. There was a sense of heaviness in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I stood in front of the door for a moment, then, unable to resist, I gently turned the knob. The room inside was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the curtains. The bed was covered with an old quilt, the furniture covered in dusty sheets as if the room had been left untouched for years. But there was something off about it, something that made my heart race. The air in the room felt stagnant, heavy with the weight of something unseen. I stepped inside and looked around, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As I moved toward the bed, I felt a coldness run through my veins. The temperature in the room had dropped drastically. It was as though the room itself was frozen in time. I reached out to pull back the curtain, hoping to get some fresh air, when I saw something in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow, perhaps, or a figment of my imagination. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it clearly. A figure standing perfectly still, watching me. I froze. The figure was tall, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, perhaps a suit or a long coat. The face was obscured by shadows, but the sense of something wrong was overwhelming. The air felt thick with tension, and I could hear my own heart thumping in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. Then, to my horror, the figure took a step forward. A soft rustling sound filled the room, and the air seemed to grow colder with every movement. It was as though the room itself was pushing me toward the figure, forcing me to stay there, paralyzed. Suddenly, the figure raised a hand, long fingers, pale and trembling, and pointed directly at me. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rapid beat of my heart. In that moment, I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, as though I was staring into the eyes of something ancient, something not meant to be seen. Before I could react, the figure vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. The cold air, the oppressive weight, all of it lifted in an instant. I blinked, unsure of what had just happened. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a hallucination, the product of too much stress, too little sleep. But the feeling of coldness remained, as if the presence had never left. I didn't sleep that night. The knocking continued, growing louder as the hours passed. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound coming from the hall. It was coming from that room. By the time the sun came up, I was already packing my things. I couldn't stay there any longer. Mrs. Harper never asked why I left, but I saw a brief flash of something in her eyes when I told her I was quitting. A mix of understanding and something darker, something she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. I moved back to the city soon after, but Willowbrook was never far from my thoughts. Sometimes late at night, I'll wake up and hear the soft knocking again. It's faint, distant, but it's there. I've never gone back to that inn, and I don't think I ever will. I don't know if it was a ghost, a memory, or something else entirely, but I'll never forget the way it felt, being watched, trapped, and knowing that something beyond the living had taken an interest in me. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had just started my new job as a security guard at the old warehouse down on Maple Street. It wasn't exactly glamorous work, but the pay was decent, and the hours fit my schedule. I'd been out of work for a while and needed something stable. The warehouse was part of a massive industrial complex, a sprawling place that had once been the lifeblood of the city but had fallen into disrepair in recent years. The area surrounding it was a mix of abandoned buildings and low-rent apartments, and during the late hours of the night, it was eerily quiet. The building I worked in was large, with high ceilings and long, narrow corridors. It hadn't been used for much other than storage for the last several decades. My job was simple. I was to walk the perimeter of the building every hour, check the security systems, and keep an eye on any intruders or signs of break-ins. My shift was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., the quiet, lonely hours when not much happened, at least as far as I was concerned. The first few nights weren't bad. I spent most of my time walking around the building, occasionally checking the old security cameras, which were outdated and barely functional. There were times when the monitors would flicker, and I'd hear strange noises, creaks, distant bangs, and shuffling sounds coming from the dark, empty corners of the warehouse. I figured it was just the building settling, or maybe the wind outside playing tricks. Still, there was something about the place that made me uneasy. One night, about 2 weeks into my shift, I had just finished walking the perimeter and was heading back to the security office when I noticed something odd. One of the doors in the back of the warehouse, which I knew was always locked, was slightly ajar. I frowned, wondering if I had missed it during my rounds. It wasn't impossible. There were hundreds of doors in the building, some of them not even part of the main entrance, and I wasn't always able to inspect every one of them. But something felt off. I approached the door carefully, glancing around to make sure no one was lurking in the shadows. As I reached for the handle, I heard a sound from the other side, like the scraping of metal against concrete. My heart skipped a beat. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The light from the hallway spilled into the dark, musty room beyond. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The room appeared to be just another storage area, filled with old crates and boxes covered in dust. But as I took a few more steps inside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the far wall, barely visible in the dim light, was a large wooden crate with strange symbols carved into it. It looked out of place, like it had been left there for decades, untouched. The symbols were unfamiliar, and they seemed to pulse faintly as though they were alive. I stepped closer to the crate, my breath coming in shallow bursts. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached out and touched the crate. The moment my fingers made contact, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot up my arm, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I quickly pulled my hand away, my heart racing. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or if something had actually happened, but the room suddenly felt colder, the air heavier. That was when I heard it. A low, guttural whisper, barely audible, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My pulse quickened as I stood frozen, listening intently. The whispering continued, growing louder, but still impossible to understand. It sounded like someone, or something, was speaking in a language I didn't recognize. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it seemed to be all around me, echoing off the walls. I backed away from the crate, my eyes darting around the room. The whispers seemed to follow me, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. I could feel the temperature dropping, the air growing thick and oppressive. I was no longer alone in that room. I could feel it. My legs were shaking, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could stand it. I had to get out of there. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I heard a loud crash from behind me, like something had fallen or been knocked over. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I spun around again, but the room was empty. Nothing had moved. I wasted no time. I ran down the hallway and back to the security office, slamming the door behind me. I locked it and took a few moments to catch my breath. I had to remind myself that it was just the building settling. That's all it was. There was no reason to panic. But as I sat there, trying to shake off the dread that had settled in my stomach, I realized that the whispers hadn't stopped. They were still in my ears, soft and unintelligible. I tried to focus on the monitors, hoping to distract myself, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Every now and then I'd glance up at the cameras, but nothing looked out of place. The footage was clear, showing empty hallways and storage rooms. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just out of sight. The next few nights were more of the same. I would hear the whispers again, sometimes from the security office, sometimes from the hallways. I checked the footage every time, but there was never anyone there. The whispers became louder, more persistent, as if they were taunting me. The coldness in the building grew more intense, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It felt like something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. Then, one night, it happened. I was walking down one of the corridors when I felt a sharp tug at the sleeve of my jacket. I spun around, but again, there was no one there. My heart raced, and I could feel my breath becoming shallow. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard a voice, a clear, audible voice, right next to my ear. Leave. It was a single word, spoken with such coldness that it sent a chill straight to my bones. I froze in place, my hand gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. I spun around, half expecting to see something standing right behind me, but again, there was nothing. No one. Just the emptiness of the warehouse stretching out in front of me. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt suffocating, oppressive. I had to get out. I turned and ran back to the security office, locking the door behind me. I sat down at the desk, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys to shut off the monitors. I couldn't stay there another minute. I needed to leave, but something told me that if I left, I would never be able to come back. That night, I made the decision to quit. The feeling of being watched was too much. The whispers, the coldness, the eerie sense of something lurking just out of sight. It wasn't something I could ignore. I packed my things quickly, grabbed my jacket, and walked out into the cool night air, feeling the weight of the building lifting from my shoulders. As I stepped away from the warehouse, I looked back one last time. The lights in the building flickered once, twice, before going dark. I could have sworn I saw someone, standing at one of the windows on the upper floor, watching me. But by the time I blinked, the window was empty. I never went back to that place, and I never took another job like it. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want to try. The building was abandoned for a while after that, but eventually it was torn down. I heard rumors that it was going to be replaced by new apartments, but I never checked. Some places are better left forgotten. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was my first job out of college, and I had just moved to a small town in the Midwest. The town wasn't particularly known for anything extraordinary, just your average place where the hustle of city life was changed for the slower pace of suburban living. But there was something oddly comforting about it. The people were kind, the streets quiet, and everything seemed to follow a predictable routine. It felt like the perfect place to start over after graduation. I worked the night shift at a local nursing home. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I liked the thought of helping the elderly, many of whom had stories to share from their long lives. The building itself was old, an outdated brick structure with narrow hallways and creaky wooden floors. It had been around since the 1960s, and while it had been updated over the years, there was something distinctly aged about it. It had that smell, familiar, hospital-like, but tinged with the scent of dust and the wood paneling that hadn't been replaced in decades. Most nights, it was just me and the night nurse on duty. Her name was Lorraine, and she had worked at the nursing home for over 20 years. She was a kind woman with a calming presence, and she'd been there long enough to know all the residents and their needs. On the other hand, I was new, unsure, and awkward. But I had a job to do. Check on the residents, make sure everyone was comfortable, and do a walkthrough of the building to ensure everything was secure. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. I'd walk the long hallways, check the locked doors, and make sure the lights were off in unused rooms. The residents mostly slept through the night, though a few were prone to wandering. Every so often, I'd have to go into one of the rooms and help an elderly person back into bed or reassure them if they were feeling anxious. But mostly it was quiet. The kind of silence that was both peaceful and unnerving at the same time. The first time I noticed something strange was a few weeks into the job. It was a particularly cold night, and there was a heavy fog rolling in from the nearby river. I was walking down the main hall near the common room when I heard what sounded like a faint sound coming from one of the resident rooms. It was a soft, almost inaudible noise, like someone was crying. At first, I thought it might have been one of the residents who had a bad night, maybe feeling lonely or confused. But as I approached the door, the sound seemed to grow louder, more distinct. It wasn't a cry, but a low, guttural, moaning sound. I knocked gently before entering, as was customary. The door was cracked open, and I pushed it gently, stepping inside. The room was dimly lit by the nightlight beside the bed, and at first I saw nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw her. Mrs. Henderson, one of the oldest residents, was sitting on her bed, her back facing me. She was mumbling something under her breath, her thin, frail form hunched over as though she was trying to speak to someone, but I couldn't understand her words. Her hair, a once beautiful shade of silver, hung loosely around her shoulders. I called out softly, "Mrs. Henderson, are you okay?" She didn't answer immediately. Then she turned her head slowly to look at me. Her eyes were wide open, but her pupils were fixed and unblinking, as though she wasn't seeing me at all. Her face was pale, and her lips curled into a strange, unsettling smile. I felt a chill run through me, not just from the cold, but from something I couldn't quite place. "Did you hear it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did I hear what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. "Are you feeling okay, Mrs. Henderson?" Her eyes remained locked onto mine, and her smile grew wider. "It's still here," she said, her voice now low and shaky. "It never left." I felt a shiver creep down my spine. I glanced around the room, expecting to see something, anything that might explain her strange behavior, but nothing was out of place. Her room was neat and tidy, the sheets perfectly made, with the occasional old photograph of her family on the nightstand. "I'll get Lorraine," I said, stepping back, but as I turned to leave, Mrs. Henderson grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. You have to listen," she whispered, her voice growing desperate. "It's still here." Before I could respond, Lorraine appeared in the doorway. Her expression immediately shifted to concern when she saw me. "Is everything all right?" she asked, walking into the room. Mrs. Henderson let go of my wrist, and with a deep breath, she settled back onto her bed, her eyes fluttering closed. "It's gone now," she said, her voice soft again, like nothing had happened. Lorraine glanced at me, her face unreadable, before she turned to Mrs. Henderson. "I'll stay with her for a bit," she said, gently coaxing the elderly woman to lie back down. "Don't worry, this happens sometimes. She gets a bit confused now and then." I left the room, but the unsettling feeling lingered. What had Mrs. Henderson meant by "it never left"? Who or what had she been speaking to? Lorraine didn't seem to think much of it, so I pushed the thought to the back of my mind. But the strange occurrences didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a pattern. Mrs. Henderson wasn't the only one to experience these eerie episodes. Other residents, particularly those in the older part of the nursing home, would sometimes act as if they were speaking to someone who wasn't there. Some would complain of hearing footsteps in the halls when no one else was around. Others would claim to see shadows moving just out of the corner of their eyes. I never saw anything myself, but it was becoming harder to dismiss. One evening, while I was making my rounds, I heard a soft whispering in the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the old building settling, but then I heard it again, closer this time. The voice was faint, and it was coming from one of the rooms on the far side of the hall. I knew all the rooms were locked, but I couldn't ignore the sound. It was a woman's voice, low and soft, almost as if it were trying to tell me something. I slowly approached the room where the voice seemed to be coming from. I checked the door, locked, just as I expected, but the whispering continued. It seemed to be calling me. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to decide what to do. I wasn't supposed to go in. No one was allowed in unless it was an emergency, and even then, the rooms had strict rules. But the voice, it was so compelling. Without thinking, I pulled out the key and unlocked the door. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight over the windows, but the voice seemed louder now, closer. I couldn't make out the words, but the sense of urgency was clear. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped further into the room. And then, as if on cue, the whispering stopped. There, in the far corner of the room, I saw it, a figure. It was faint, translucent, but there, a woman, standing with her back turned to me. Her hair was long and dark, and her dress seemed old-fashioned, like something from another time. I froze, unable to move, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me, but I could feel her presence. Heavy, oppressive, like the air had thickened around me. And then in a voice that was no longer a whisper, but a cold, empty sound, the woman spoke. "Help me." The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through the room, and before I could react, the figure vanished. I stumbled back out of the room, the door slamming shut behind me. I leaned against the wall, gasping for air, my mind reeling. What had I just seen? Who was she? That night I went to Lorraine and told her everything. She listened in silence, her expression grim. "You saw her," she said quietly. "You saw Sarah." I was confused. "Who's Sarah?" Lorraine sighed and leaned back in her chair, her face pained. "Sarah was one of the first residents here. She died many years ago, but it's said that her spirit never left. She was a young woman, and her death was never fully explained. Some say she died of natural causes, but others say it was something darker. Ever since then, strange things have happened around this place. I think she's still here, still trying to find peace. I left the nursing home that night, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and questions. But one thing was certain. Whatever had happened, whatever was haunting that building, wasn't going to be easy to escape. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It started with the house. I had always wanted a place of my own, somewhere I could settle in and call home. The moment I saw the ad for the house, I was intrigued. It was an old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of town, not too far from the forest. The price was shockingly low for such a grand property, which was the first thing that caught my attention. I couldn't understand why it was so affordable, but I figured it was just a stroke of luck. The house needed some work, sure, but nothing I couldn't handle. It was a large 3-story building with a wraparound porch and a giant overgrown garden. The windows were tall and narrow, covered with vines, and there was a dilapidated gazebo at the back of the property that had clearly seen better days. The inside wasn't in terrible shape either, just dusty and a little worn. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper, the floors creaked beneath every step, and the stairs had a slight bend in them that made me feel like I was sinking into the past every time I ascended. When I first moved in, I thought the house had character. It had an old, nostalgic charm to it that I couldn't resist. The previous owner had apparently lived there for decades, though no one seemed to know much about her. She had passed away quietly in her sleep, which made the whole thing seem rather uneventful. There were no strange circumstances, no mysterious deaths to explain the unusually low price. It was just an old house with an old lady who had lived a quiet life and passed away peacefully. But there were things I started to notice right away, things that didn't make sense. At first, it was the noises, subtle creaks in the floorboards, the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor in the middle of the night, and footsteps that echoed when no one was there. I told myself it was just an old house settling, that the floorboards had just gotten used to the weight of the new tenant. But the noises didn't stop, and they started to feel deliberate, like someone was walking around when I wasn't looking. It was a week after I moved in that I first saw the figure. It was late at night, and I had just gotten into bed. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting strange shadows on the walls. I had just closed my eyes when I heard it, a soft, dragging sound, followed by a faint scraping noise. I sat up, heart pounding, and glanced around the room. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing in the doorway. It was a silhouette, but I could make out the outline of a woman, thin and tall, with long, flowing hair. She was just standing there, looking at me with empty eyes. I blinked, and she was gone. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, or some kind of sleep deprivation playing with my mind. But as the days passed, the occurrences only grew more frequent. There were other instances, too. Sometimes when I was downstairs cooking, I would feel a cold breeze, as if someone had opened a window. But when I checked, all the windows were tightly shut. The lights would flicker, sometimes for minutes at a time, and doors would open by themselves. I would go into the living room, only to find the door to the hallway wide open, even though I was certain I had closed it behind me. Then there were the whispers. They were faint at first, like a soft murmur just out of reach. But it wasn't long before they became more distinct. I would hear them when I was alone, walking through the hallways, drifting just behind me like a breath on my neck. The voices were soft and unintelligible, but they were always there, just enough to make me question my sanity. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. But deep down, I knew what was happening. The house was haunted. One night, after a particularly disturbing incident in which I heard someone pacing the hallway outside my bedroom door, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight, determined to find some explanation for the noises. I walked through the dark, cold halls, shining the beam of light across the old walls, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No loose boards, no rats, no reason for the strange sounds. I reached the attic, where the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of old wood. The door creaked loudly as I opened it, and the light from my flashlight barely cut through the dark. The attic was empty, save for old furniture covered in sheets and boxes stacked in corners. But there, in the farthest corner, I saw something, a figure standing silently, watching me. It was the same woman from before, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. I froze, unable to move. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She just stood there, watching me with a look of deep sorrow. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, trapped by her gaze. Then, in a sudden flash of cold, the figure disappeared. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I had to get out of that house, but something kept me there. I couldn't explain it. The house had a hold on me, something dark and heavy that I couldn't shake off. I couldn't leave. Not yet. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the whispers that grew louder and more insistent as the hours passed. The figure kept appearing, first in the corners of my vision, then right in front of me, standing by the door, staring at me. I couldn't escape her, no matter how hard I tried. The house was no longer a home. It was a prison. I did some research the next day, hoping to find an explanation, hoping that someone else had lived there and experienced the same things. I went to the local library and dug through old town records, trying to find anything about the house or its previous owner. That's when I found it. The house had been built in the late 1800s, and the woman who had lived there, the one who had passed away peacefully, wasn't the first. The first owner had been a man named Thomas Willard, a wealthy businessman who had built the house for his wife and daughter. But a year after moving in, his wife had died under strange circumstances. No one knew exactly how. Some said it was an accident. Others said it was something more sinister. Shortly after, his daughter went missing, and the townspeople speculated that he had something to do with it. Some whispered that he had locked her away in the attic, where she died alone. His wife's death, his daughter's disappearance, and his own strange behavior led to rumors that the house was cursed. As I read the history of the house, the pieces started to fall into place. The whispers, the shadows, the cold spots, they were all connected to the tragedies that had occurred within those walls. The woman I had seen, the one who had haunted me, was not just a random ghost. She was the daughter, lost and trapped in the house, unable to find peace. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the empty space in front of me. The temperature had dropped, and the whispers grew louder. I knew I couldn't live in that house any longer. It had taken hold of me, just as it had taken hold of so many before me. The woman's face, pale and sorrowful, haunted my every waking moment. I packed up my things the next morning, unable to stay any longer. As I was about to leave, I heard a knock at the door. Hesitant, I opened it, half expecting to see nothing. But standing there was an older woman, her face wrinkled with age, her eyes tired but kind. She introduced herself as the granddaughter of the original owner, and I recognized her name from the records I had found. She had come to visit, she explained, to check on the house. But when I told her what had been happening, she grew quiet. "It's been that way for years," she said softly. "The house is cursed." And it's not just the spirits that linger. It's the memories, the regrets, the lost souls who can't let go. You're not the first to experience it. Many have tried to live here, but none have lasted. I nodded, understanding. It was time to leave before I became another lost soul. As I walked away from the house, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard. I never looked back. The house, with its dark history and tragic past, was now someone else's problem. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was late fall when I first moved into the old house on Maple Street. I had been searching for an affordable place to live for months, and when I stumbled upon this one, it seemed like fate. The rent was reasonable, the neighborhood quiet, and the house, though old and a bit rundown, had a charm that I found comforting. I figured it would be a good place to start fresh, away from the bustle of city life. The house itself was a 2-story, Victorian-style building with dark wood paneling on the outside and overgrown ivy creeping up the sides. The windows were tall and narrow, and the roof had a slight slope that gave it a Gothic appearance. The front yard had a few trees, and the backyard was surrounded by a tall, iron fence. There was something strangely appealing about its eerie aura. It felt like it belonged to another time, a time when the world was simpler, quieter. But there was also an underlying sense of discomfort, a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. My first night in the house, I had trouble sleeping. It wasn't the creaks of the floorboards or the old pipes groaning in the walls. Those were things I could get used to. What disturbed me was the silence. It was too quiet. I kept expecting to hear the hum of traffic or people talking outside, but there nothing. Just this oppressive silence that settled over the house like a blanket. The next few days passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. The house, despite its age, was surprisingly well kept. There was no sign of mold or decay, and the furniture was in decent condition. The landlord, an older man with thick glasses, had assured me that everything in the house was in working order, and so far, I had no reason to doubt him. Still, there was something about the place that made me uneasy. It wasn't just the isolation or the odd quietness. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. At night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take over. And while I often managed to drift off, there were moments when I would wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, the air thick with a sense of dread. I'd tell myself it was just nerves, that I was overthinking things, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't until the third week that things began to take a more unsettling turn. I woke up one morning to find that the front door was open. Wide open. I knew for a fact that I had locked it the night before, as I always did. The lock was old, and the door had a tendency to get stuck, so it took some effort to close it properly. But there it was, standing wide open as if someone had come in during the night. I checked the house thoroughly. Every room, every window, every closet, but there was no sign of forced entry. Nothing was missing, and there were no footprints on the floor or signs of struggle. It was as if whoever had opened the door had done so quietly, without leaving a trace. I felt my skin prickle with unease, but I chalked it up to a simple mistake. Maybe I had forgotten to lock the door the night before. Maybe the wind had blown it open. Anything was possible, right? But then, things got stranger. A few days later, I was sitting in the living room reading a book when I heard a soft thud from upstairs. It was faint, almost like the sound of something heavy falling to the floor. I froze, listening intently, but when nothing else followed, I shrugged it off as the house settling. After all, it was an old building, and creaks and groans were to be expected. But as the days wore on, I began to notice more odd occurrences. The lights would flicker in the middle of the night. The lamps in the hallway would turn on by themselves, and doors that I was sure I had closed would be wide open when I returned to a room. Sometimes I would hear the sound of footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around on the second floor. I'd rush upstairs to find the rooms empty, the floorboards undisturbed. Then came the whispers. I was in the kitchen making dinner one evening when I heard a soft voice. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the living room. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the voice grew clearer. It sounded like a woman, but the words were garbled, distorted, as though she was speaking from a great distance. I turned off the stove, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked cautiously toward the living room. When I reached the doorway, there was nothing there. The room was empty, save for the furniture. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. I convinced myself that it was just the wind outside, or maybe the sound of the house settling. I tried to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. The following night, I decided to get to the bottom of it. I set up a camera in the living room to record whatever was happening when I wasn't around. I wanted proof, something tangible to explain all the strange occurrences. I went to bed that night, determined to get some sleep and figure out what was going on. When I woke up the next morning, I immediately checked the footage. My heart sank as I watched the video. At around 3 a.m., the lights in the living room flickered on, then off, then on again. The camera's lens caught movement, something shifting in the shadows, and then I saw it, a faint outline of a figure. A woman, standing in the corner of the room, her face obscured by darkness. She didn't move, just stood there, watching. I felt my stomach churn as I watched the footage again and again, trying to make sense of it. But it was clear. There was something in the house with me. I couldn't bring myself to go into the living room for the rest of the day. I spent most of the time pacing back and forth in the kitchen, trying to figure out what to do. Should I leave? Call the landlord? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house much longer. That evening, I sat down with my phone and did some research on the house. I found an old article online that mentioned the property. It was part of a historical district, and at one point, it had been the site of a tragic event. Years ago, a woman named Margaret Walker had lived in the house with her family. One night, she had disappeared without a trace, and her body was never found. The police suspected foul play, but there was no evidence to suggest who was responsible. Her family moved away, and the house was left empty for years. Locals had whispered about the house being haunted, but no one had ever dared to investigate. The article mentioned that the house had been sold several times over the years, but no one had ever stayed for long. A pattern began to emerge. Everyone who had lived in the house seemed to leave abruptly, sometimes in the middle of the night. The rumors about Margaret's disappearance persisted, and over time, the house had gained a reputation for being cursed. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the article. Margaret's disappearance, the whispers, the strange occurrences, it all seemed to be connected. I didn't know what to believe, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone in that house. That night, I tried to confront whatever was haunting me. I stood in the living room, the lights dimmed, and I spoke out loud, demanding the spirit to show itself. I told it I wasn't afraid, that I wanted answers. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the silence of the house. Then the temperature dropped. The air grew heavy, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the voice returned. Louder this time. Clearer. It was no longer a whisper. It was a scream. I fled the house that night, never to return. I never learned the full truth about what happened to Margaret Walker or what happened in that house all those years ago. But I don't need to know. What I experienced there was enough to convince me that some things, some places are better left alone. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I'd never been the type of person to believe in ghosts. As a kid, I'd often listen to people talk about haunted houses, shadowy figures, and eerie sounds, but I always thought it was just superstition or imagination running wild. I was more of a skeptic, grounded in what I could see, touch, and understand. But that all changed one summer in my late 20s when I took a trip to visit a friend who lived in a small, quiet town in the foothills of the Adirondacks. The trip was supposed to be an escape, a break from my hectic life in the city. Little did I know it would turn into something I'd never be able to forget. My friend, Claire, had moved to this remote town about a year before, and I hadn't had the chance to visit until now. She worked as a therapist at a local clinic, and her house was a charming old farmhouse she had bought from an elderly couple who had lived there for decades. It was one of those houses with creaky floors, vintage wallpaper, and a sense of history that seemed to seep out of every corner. I arrived late in the afternoon after a long drive, and Claire was there to greet me with her usual smile and warmth. "It's so good to see you," she exclaimed, giving me a big hug. "Come on in, I'll show you around. The place is a little spooky at night, but you'll get used to it. It's just the house settling. It's old." I laughed, but a small part of me was already on edge. The house was lovely, no doubt, but it had that quiet, almost oppressive atmosphere that some old homes seem to have. As Claire gave me the grand tour, she mentioned the history of the place, how the previous owners had lived there for over 50 years, and how they had been in their 90s when they sold it. She told me the house was built in the early 1900s, and though she had fixed it up a bit, there were still parts of it that felt frozen in time. As night began to fall, Claire and I sat on the porch with a couple of glasses of wine, chatting about life, work, and old memories. The town was quiet, as usual, with nothing but the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. We laughed and reminisced until the light from the porch lamp flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. "Ugh, that lamp's been acting up all week," Claire muttered, standing up. "Let me get the spare flashlight. I'll be right back." As she went inside, I took a moment to enjoy the stillness of the night. The air was crisp and cool, and I felt a strange sensation of being completely alone in the world. It wasn't unpleasant, just isolating. I couldn't explain it. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the darkness, a shape just beyond the edge of the porch near the trees. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there, just the dark outline of the trees swaying in the wind. "Everything okay?" Claire called from inside, breaking my focus. "Yeah, just thought I saw something," I replied, shaking my head. "Maybe I'm just tired." Claire returned with the flashlight and we sat back down to continue our conversation. But the strange feeling lingered, like I was being watched. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, and the night wore on without incident. But that's when the first strange thing happened. Later that night, after we'd gone to bed, I woke up to a loud banging sound. I shot up, my heart racing, and looked around the room. The house was dark, except for the faint glow from the moonlight filtering through the curtains. The noise stopped just as suddenly as it had started. I lay there in the silence, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling, but the noise had been too distinct, too deliberate. It was almost like something or someone was knocking on the walls. I waited a few moments before finally turning on the light. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked the windows and the door, making sure everything was locked. Claire was still sound asleep in the other bed, unaware of the noise. I couldn't explain it, so I chalked it up to the house's age and tried to go back to sleep. But the next night, the knocking came again. This time it was louder, more persistent. I lay there in the darkness, frozen in place, listening as the sounds echoed through the house. It wasn't just one or two knocks. It was rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone was tapping at the walls with purpose. I couldn't stand it anymore. I threw the covers off and rushed to Claire's room. "Claire, wake up! Do you hear that?" I whispered urgently, but there was no answer. I pushed the door open slowly, and when I saw her, my stomach twisted. Claire was sitting up in bed, staring straight ahead, her eyes wide open but unblinking. She didn't move, didn't say anything, just stared. "Claire?" I whispered again, my voice shaking. She blinked once, then slowly turned to face me. "Sorry," she said softly. "I must have dozed off." "What are you talking about?" I asked, now really freaked out. "You were sitting up like you were awake." She looked at me like I was crazy. "I wasn't sitting up. I was sleeping. Are you okay?" I didn't know what to say. I stood there, staring at her for a long time, unsure of what to believe. But the knocking, the strange feeling that had been growing inside me, wasn't just in my head. Over the next few days, things continued to get weirder. The knocking persisted every night, not always at the same time. Around 3 a.m., it was coming from the walls, the floors, sometimes even from beneath the house. I started feeling cold spots in certain rooms, like a draft that wouldn't go away. Claire had started to notice it too, but she still refused to acknowledge it. "It's just the old house, like I told you," she'd say with a nervous laugh. But the laughter never reached her eyes. I could tell something was bothering her, something she wasn't saying. One afternoon, I decided to dig into the history of the house. I went down to the local library, hoping to find some old newspaper articles or town records that might explain the strange occurrences. I talked to an elderly librarian who seemed to know a lot about the area's history. She smiled when I asked about the house. "Oh, Willowbrook House," she said with a chuckle. "That place has a reputation. It's been around for a long time. The original owners were the Fletchers. They were a quiet family, kept to themselves, but people used to talk about strange things happening there. I'm not surprised you're hearing noises." "Why?" I asked, curious now. "Well, the story goes that the father, Thomas Fletcher, went missing one winter, just disappeared. No one knows if he left or if something happened to him. But they say his wife, Margaret, was never the same after that. She lived in the house alone with their 2 children until she died in the early 1900s. After that, the house sat empty for years before the next owners moved in." I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about the way she said it, so matter-of-factly, made my blood run cold. "That's it? That's the whole story?" I asked, wanting more details. "Pretty much," she replied. "People around here say Margaret's spirit never left. Some folks say she's still in the house. You'll hear knocks, doors creaking, windows opening. People have claimed to see a woman in a long dress walking through the halls at night. But like I said, it's just an old house with a lot of history." When I returned to Claire's house that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The knocking had already started again. It was coming from the walls, louder than ever. I walked around the house, feeling my skin crawl as I moved from room to room, but I couldn't find the source. And then, in the living room, I found something I wasn't expecting. On the floor, beneath the coffee table, was an old photograph. It was a black and white image of a woman in a long, dark dress, standing in front of the house. Her face was pale, her features sharp and unsettling. It was Margaret Fletcher. I picked it up, staring at the woman in the picture. There was something haunting about her expression, something in her eyes that made my heart race. I turned the photograph over. There, written in faded ink, were the words, "Don't stay here too long." The knock came again. This time, it was coming from inside the walls, as if something was trying to get out. And that was when I realized the truth. The house wasn't just old. It wasn't just settling. Something else was inside. Something that didn't want to be forgotten. That night, I packed my bags and left. Claire didn't understand why I was leaving so suddenly. She tried to convince me it was just my imagination, that I was letting old stories get to me. But I knew. I knew what I had felt, what I had seen. I never went back. Story the end.
Story number 11.
I hadn't seen my cousin Derek in nearly 8 years when he messaged me out of the blue in late 2022. We'd grown up somewhat close, but he'd moved to Oregon after high school, and we lost touch. His message was short, almost awkward. "Hey, you still in California? I might be coming down for work. Might need a place for a few weeks. Mind if I crash with you?" At first, I hesitated. I live alone in a quiet 2-bedroom condo near Sacramento, and I like my privacy. But I remembered how close we used to be as kids and figured a few weeks wouldn't hurt. I replied that he was welcome to stay. He showed up the following week with just a duffel bag and a strange air about him, like he was always half distracted or listening to something I couldn't hear. That first night, we caught up over beers. He looked tired, more than tired, really. He looked worn down. At one point, he went quiet and asked, "Do you believe in ghosts?" I thought he was joking, but he was completely serious. I told him I didn't, not really. He nodded like he expected that. "I didn't either," he said, "until they followed me." I laughed at first. I thought maybe he meant something metaphorical, guilt or memories or something, but he was dead serious. I didn't push him, and he didn't offer more. We changed the subject and kept drinking, but a strange tension hung in the air. That night, I woke up around 3:40 a.m. to the sound of heavy footsteps above me, which made no sense because my condo is a single-story unit. There's no upstairs. My heart kicked a little harder in my chest as I lay there staring at the ceiling. The steps were slow, deliberate, and directly above my bed. Then they stopped. I got up, half thinking maybe Derek was sleepwalking. I found him in the guest room, sound asleep and snoring. There was no way he could have been making those noises. I checked the entire place. No sign of anything out of place. I figured maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the beer had messed with my sleep. But the next day, things got weirder. Derek stayed in the guest room most of the morning, and when he finally came out around noon, he looked awful. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands shook slightly as he poured himself coffee. I asked if he was okay, and he stared at me for a moment before saying, "Did you hear them last night?" I paused. "What do you mean?" "The footsteps. They always come around that time." He sipped his coffee. "Didn't used to. Used to be random. But lately it's like they're keeping a schedule." That made me feel sick to my stomach. I didn't want to encourage whatever paranoid spiral he was on, but I couldn't lie. Yes, I had heard them. He just nodded and walked outside to smoke. Over the next few days, I started noticing little things. A cold draft in the hallway that had no source. Doors that creaked open on their own even when latched shut. The sound of whispering, too faint to make out, but clear enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. Derek avoided the guest room during the day. He would stay in the living room or on the porch and only went in there to sleep. I asked him once why, and he said, "They stay quiet if I don't look at them." That sentence chilled me. What did that mean? Look at them. One night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. Not on the door, not on the walls. From inside the hallway closet, it was slow, rhythmic. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. I grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat and opened the door. Nothing, just jackets and an old vacuum cleaner. But when I closed the door again, the knocking resumed, and Derek came out of his room, his face pale and expression grim. "You opened it," he said. "Don't open it again." The next day, I finally confronted him. "What the hell is going on, Derek? Did something happen to you?" He sat down, rubbing his temples like he had a migraine. Then he told me the story. About 6 months before he came to stay with me, he'd taken a job doing maintenance for a remote ski resort in Oregon. The place had been shut down since the pandemic and was only just reopening. He was there alone for a few weeks before the staff came back, fixing broken pipes, replacing light fixtures, checking the furnace, all that. The resort itself was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by forest. One night, he'd been walking back to his cabin when he saw something standing at the tree line. At first, he thought it was a deer. Then it stood up, on 2 legs. It wasn't shaped right, he said. It was too thin, way too tall. And its arms were too long. I thought maybe it was some freak accident or someone playing a prank. But then it screamed. He said the sound was like a woman screaming, but warped and stretched, like someone was fast-forwarding the noise. He ran back to his cabin and locked the door. All night, it circled the cabin. He heard it scraping along the wood, tapping on the windows, whispering in a voice that didn't sound human. He left the next morning, quit the job, and never went back. But things got worse after that. Lights in his apartment would flicker even after being replaced. Voices would wake him up in the middle of the night, whispering his name. Then it started following him. Hotel rooms, Airbnbs, his car, and now, apparently, my place. I wanted to call him crazy. I wanted to believe he was having a breakdown or something, but I couldn't explain the things I'd been experiencing. And the way the air would change at night, like the temperature dropped 20 degrees the moment the sun set, wasn't normal. That night, the footsteps returned. Louder, heavier. This time, they didn't stop above my bed. They moved through the hallway into the living room and paused outside my bedroom door. I held my breath under the covers like a child. Then slowly the door handle turned. It opened halfway and then creaked shut again. I got up, heart pounding, and ran to Derek's room. He was sitting up in bed, like eyes wide open. "You saw it too," he whispered. I nodded. After that night, we started sleeping in the same room with the lights on. We didn't talk about it much during the day. Both of us were afraid we might make it worse by acknowledging it. But the tension kept building. Objects began to move. My kitchen chairs would be pulled away from the table in the morning. The faucet would turn on by itself. I'd find small piles of dirt in the hallway, as if someone had been tracking it in from outside, though neither of us wore shoes indoors. Then came the night when we saw it. We were in the living room around 11 p.m., watching a movie to distract ourselves. The lights flickered and I paused the movie. The flickering stopped and everything was quiet. Too quiet. Even the crickets and the usual neighborhood sounds seemed to vanish. Then something walked into the hallway. It was tall. Too tall to be human. Its skin looked like wet paper stretched over bones. Its eyes weren't eyes at all, just black pits that seemed to drink in the light. It moved without sound, gliding more than walking. Derek didn't move. Neither did I. We just watched it as it turned its head toward us, slowly, and smiled, or at least its mouth stretched wide in what might have been a smile. There were too many teeth, and they weren't shaped right. It stepped forward. That was enough to break whatever hold it had over us. I grabbed Derek and ran out the back door. We didn't stop until we were 2 blocks away, gasping and shaking. We stayed at a motel that night. The next morning, we returned. The front door was open. Nothing inside was broken, but the place felt hollow, like the soul of it had been sucked out. Derek left the next day. He apologized but said he couldn't stay. I understood. It's been 6 months since he left. I had the condo blessed by a priest, smudged it with sage, did everything people said might help. But I still hear the footsteps sometimes. Still find the closet door open, even though I lock it. Still wake up around 3:40 a.m. heart racing, listening to the silence that feels too heavy. A few weeks ago, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed my living room. But in the photo, there was something standing in the corner. Too tall, too thin, watching the couch. Neither Derek nor I were home that day. Story the end.
Story number 12.
He was already moved out, working construction jobs in different cities, only dropping by once every couple months. Still, despite the distance, he was always kind to me in his own quiet way. When I turned 16, he gave me his old leather wallet, worn but still in good shape, with $50 inside and a note that said, "Buy something that scares you a little. It's how you grow." That was the last birthday I had with him. 3 weeks later, Matt was gone. It was ruled an accident. He'd been working on a site in this small town up north, fell from scaffolding. They said he died instantly. No one in our family knew many details, just what was given to us by the company. Mom was shattered. I was just confused. Something about the whole thing never made sense. He wasn't careless. I'd seen him scale roofs and frame houses like it was nothing. But no one wanted to talk about it, so I stopped asking. A year passed. Mom moved to Florida with her sister, said she couldn't stay in the house anymore. I was in college, scraping by, working nights at a gas station near campus. One evening in late October, I got a letter, yes, an actual letter in the mail. No return address, just my name in big, hard-pressed handwriting. Inside was a single page, no greeting, no explanation, just 5 words, "Help me, Cold Creek Motel." That was it. It felt like a prank. I even laughed a little, thought maybe someone from school was messing with me. But something about the way it was written, those jagged, almost frantic letters, bothered me. The name, though, stuck out more than anything. Cold Creek Motel. I'd heard of it before. It was the motel Matt had been staying at when he died. He hadn't fallen on site. He'd fallen off the second-floor balcony of his room there, middle of the night. Somehow, that fact had slipped through the official reports, or maybe no one in the family wanted to share it. But I remembered hearing something about it at the funeral from one of his friends who showed up late, drunk, and emotional. I tried to ignore it. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. But that night, while I sat in the gas station watching the security monitor cycle through empty pumps and rain-soaked asphalt, I kept thinking about the words. Help me. I kept hearing it in Matt's voice. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I borrowed my roommate's car and made the 5-hour drive north. The closer I got to Cold Creek, the worse the weather turned. The town was smaller than I expected. Just a main street, a couple diners, a gas station, and the motel sitting at the far edge like a worn-out limb ready to be amputated. It looked abandoned, the sign flickering in the rain, letters missing so that it just read CLDCEK. There was no front desk, just a bell and a cracked glass window with yellowed brochures curling behind it. I rang the bell once, twice. Finally, a man emerged from the back room, thin, hunched, with sunken eyes and a look like he'd been exhumed instead of woken. He didn't say anything, just handed me a room key without asking for ID or money. Room 209. Matt's room. I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't want to know. I climbed the stairs slowly. The hallway smelled like mildew and wet wood. The carpet squished under my shoes. Room 209's door looked like it had been kicked in once and never properly fixed. The key turned with a reluctant click. The room inside was normal. Worn but clean. A bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, an old box TV bolted to a stand, the remote taped together. The bathroom door hung crooked on its hinges. There were 2 windows, one facing the parking lot, the other a side view into trees and fog. I sat on the bed, unsure of what I expected. Maybe a voice. A vision. But there was nothing, just rain tapping on the windows and the hum of a fridge that didn't work. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes again, it was dark outside. The TV was on, static. I hadn't touched the remote. Then I heard the shower. Just the faint hiss of water running, steady and wrong. The bathroom door creaked slowly open and light spilled into the room. I sat up, heart thudding so loud I couldn't think. I stepped toward the bathroom. The door was fully open now. The light above the mirror flickered. The shower curtain was pulled shut. Steam fogged the cracked mirror. I grabbed the edge of the curtain and yanked it aside. Empty. No water, just wet tiles and footprints. Bare footprints, leading out of the tub and across the floor. I backed away, stomach knotting. The TV cut from static to a high-pitched whine. I turned to it, hands trembling when the screen changed. For less than a second, it showed Matt's face. Just a flicker, like a frame out of place. His face looking directly at me. Mouth open. Eyes wild. Then static again. The power cut. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of the room, phone flashlight aimed at the door. But nothing else happened that night. In the morning, I went to the diner down the road. The waitress didn't smile when I walked in. No one did. I asked her about the motel, about what happened to my brother. She froze. Her eyes flicked to the cook behind the counter, then back to me. "You shouldn't be staying there," she said quietly. I asked why. She paused, then leaned in. "You want the truth? People don't just fall there. They jump. Or they're pushed. No one ever hears anything. Just a thud. Then the lights flicker and it starts again." I asked her what she meant. She didn't answer. Back at the motel, I found a closet door inside the room I hadn't noticed before. Narrow, warped, like it had been sealed shut for a long time. It didn't open easily. I had to wedge it with a screwdriver from the car. Inside was a ladder leading down. This made no sense. There shouldn't be a crawl space under the second floor. But the ladder kept going. The air that came from below was freezing. I climbed down, flashlight in my teeth, each rung colder than the last. The bottom opened into a room. No, a corridor, lined with doors. All of them numbered, none of them matching the actual rooms above. They looked like basement lockers. Some were open, others shut tight. I passed one that was ajar and peeked inside. Empty room. Except the walls were covered in writing, scratched in, dozens of names, dozens of help-me's, all etched into the plaster. One caught my eye. Matt Reynolds. My blood turned to ice. Suddenly, all the doors slammed shut at once. I ran, sprinting through the corridor, my flashlight flickering. I made it to the ladder and climbed faster than I thought I could. I sealed the closet behind me and moved the dresser in front of it. That night, I tried to leave, but the car wouldn't start. My phone had no signal. The motel's front office was locked, dark. The town looked deserted. Even the diner was closed. I went back to the room. There was nowhere else to go. At midnight, the room turned cold, not chilly, frozen. My breath fogged in front of me. The window facing the parking lot turned black like it had been painted over. Then the other window began to bleed. Not literally, but the fog outside thickened, and behind it I saw a face. Then another, and another, pressed to the glass, staring in. They weren't human. Their eyes were wrong, deep and hollow, mouths open like they were screaming, but there was no sound. Then Matt appeared, outside the window. He looked just like in the photo from his last birthday, smiling, but now his smile looked stretched, like it hurt. He pressed his hand to the glass. I stepped forward, heartbreaking and terrified. He mouthed something. "Go back." Then he looked over his shoulder and his smile vanished. He began pounding on the glass, harder and harder, mouthing "go" over and over, until the window cracked. I backed away. The lights exploded. Darkness swallowed the room. The last thing I heard was the door creaking open and a voice, not Matt's, but close, whispering, "Stay." I woke up in my car, parked by the highway 5 miles from town. No memory of how I got there. My phone was working. It was noon. I drove home. A week later, I went back to the address on the motel's business listing. It was gone. Burned down years ago, according to the town records. They said it was condemned after a string of unexplained deaths. Officially closed in 2006. Matt died in 2018. I keep the note in my drawer. The original one that brought me there. Every few weeks, it smells faintly of smoke. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake up freezing, and I hear footsteps outside my window. Then I hear his voice, "Go back." But I won't. Not ever again. Story the end.
Story number 13.
A few years ago, my cousin Jason moved to upstate New York to take a job as a groundskeeper at an old Jesuit college that had been converted into a retreat and rehabilitation center. The place was massive, surrounded by pine forest on 3 sides, with old stone buildings, long walkways, and even a bell tower that hadn't worked in decades. He wasn't one to scare easily. He'd served in the Navy and worked search and rescue in the mountains of Oregon before taking this job. So when he started calling me, talking about strange things at the center, I paid attention. It started small. Jason told me the place just felt off. He'd be mowing the lawn or trimming hedges and feel like someone was behind him. Nothing dramatic, just that quiet sense you get when you know you're being watched. Then he started finding odd things in the woods. Once, he came across a circle of stones precisely arranged with burned-out candles at the edges and bones in the middle. He reported it, of course. The director of the center, an older woman named Marianne, just told him it was probably left by some teenagers sneaking in at night and warned him not to engage if he saw anyone. He didn't buy that. "Those bones looked clean," he said on the phone one night, his voice low and tense. "I know what raccoon or deer bones look like. These were smaller. Not animal, clean and small." A few weeks after that, he started seeing things. He thought he was imagining it at first. Shadows moving inside the old administration building after hours, figures darting past the windows when no one should have been there. The weirdest part was that the building had been sealed for asbestos remediation. No one was allowed inside. Then he saw a man standing behind the third-floor window at dusk. Jason was trimming the hedges and looked up to see him, just standing there, motionless, staring out through the glass. The man was wearing a black cassock like a priest, but his skin was gray, lips sunken, eyes almost too wide. Jason dropped his trimmers and ran inside, ignoring the tape and signs on the doors. But when he got up to the third floor, the place was empty. There was dust everywhere, thick enough that no one had been in for months. No footprints, no sign of anyone. He was visibly shaken after that. When I went up to visit, I could see it on his face. This was a guy who used to dive into pitch-black water during storm rescues, and now he was jumping at creeks in the hallway. I stayed the night in one of the visitor rooms. It was a quiet, cold place. Thick walls that seemed to absorb every sound, and long corridors that echoed even the faintest footstep. The center was half full at the time, mostly older patients recovering from surgeries or dealing with long-term illness. Around midnight, I woke to someone whispering just outside the door. Not just a passing voice. This was right at the door, like someone crouched with their mouth against the wood. I froze. The voice was whispering a name over and over. Marielle. 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 I got up slowly, heart pounding, and looked through the peephole. No one. The hallway was dim, lit only by an old sconce at the end. I waited a minute, opened the door, and stepped out. Nothing. I walked the hallway, checked both ends. There were no nurses or guests awake, no doors open. The air was heavy like it gets before a thunderstorm, except the sky had been clear. Jason had a theory. He'd been digging into the place's history and found that one of the last Jesuit priests assigned to the college before it closed had disappeared. Father Samuel Bruck. He was reportedly eccentric and had been conducting unsanctioned studies in demonology. Officially, the church said he'd left the order. But Jason got a look at a hidden ledger in the basement, tucked inside an old cabinet where someone had written, "Return to the Hollow. Watch the bell." That phrase stuck with him. Watch the bell. One night, we decided to do just that. The bell tower was off limits, sealed decades ago, but Jason had keys to everything. We waited until most of the center's residents were asleep, then headed up the winding stone staircase. The air was thick with dust, and the higher we went, the more claustrophobic it felt. You'd think a bell tower would open up as you rose, but it was the opposite. Tighter, darker, almost like the place didn't want us reaching the top. When we got to the final landing, the door to the bell chamber was rotted, half hanging on its hinges. Jason pushed it open with the butt of a flashlight. Inside, the room was cavernous and strangely quiet. The bell still hung, tarnished with age, thick with cobwebs. I couldn't explain it, but I had this pressure in my chest the moment I stepped inside, like my body wanted to curl in on itself. Jason walked around the edges, inspecting things. I stayed in the center. That's when I saw the markings, scratched into the floorboards around the bell. Circles, symbols, Latin phrases. One was clear, malum non dormit. Evil does not sleep. Jason turned to say something, but his face twisted into terror. Behind you! I spun and caught just a flicker. A figure in black, rushing past the far side of the bell. We both ran toward it, but there was nowhere to go. No ladder, no exit, just the bell and four walls. We got out of there fast. That night, back in his room, Jason pulled up a thermal camera he'd installed in the bell tower weeks earlier. He hadn't told me about it because he didn't want me to think he was losing it. He scrubbed through the footage and stopped at something from 3 nights prior. The camera, facing the bell, caught a shape, a dark human figure, unmoving, standing right beneath the bell. No heat signature, no motion. It was there for exactly 1 hour, then gone in a blink. Things escalated after that. Patients started reporting nightmares, many of them describing the same figure. A priest without eyes standing at the foot of their bed whispering Latin. Nurses dismissed it as medication side effects, but it happened too often to ignore. One woman, a stroke patient in her 70s, became hysterical after seeing him and locked herself in her bathroom for 3 hours. She scratched "broke" into the tile with her fingernail. She had never heard the name before. Jason had never mentioned it to anyone. Jason started sleeping in shifts. He looked awful. Sunken eyes, trembling hands, constantly glancing over his shoulder. He told me he'd found a crawl space beneath the chapel and wanted to check it out. I told him to leave it alone. He didn't listen. The crawl space was behind a false wall under the altar. Inside, there was a chamber of some kind, barely tall enough to crouch in. He found decayed robes, charred books, and a small stone basin filled with what looked like dried blood. On the wall was the same phrase again, "Return to the hollow." That night, the bell rang. 3 slow tolls, deep, guttural sounds that shook the walls. No one had heard that bell in decades. Residents woke screaming. The power went out for over an hour. Jason and I met by flashlight and sprinted up to the tower. The bell was still swaying when we got there. No wind, no movement, but the bell. We left the next day. Jason quit his job. Marianne was furious, but he didn't care. He moved back to Oregon and refused to talk about the place for a year. I tried bringing it up, but he'd shut down. Finally, he told me he kept hearing the bell in his dreams. 2 months later, he took his own life. He left no note, just a Bible open to a passage underlined in red ink. He went out and hanged himself, and the field was called the Field of Blood. I went back once a year after his funeral. I didn't go inside, just stood outside the fence at dusk, watching the tower. Right as the sun dipped below the trees, I saw it, the figure, standing behind the glass of the third-floor window, motionless, watching. Story the end.
Story number 14.
On a drizzling Tuesday evening in late November, I took a detour through the mountain pass near Kings Hollow because a rock slide had blocked the main road. The highway detour was longer and the gas light had just come on. I was driving a company van with no working radio, and my phone had no signal through most of the pass. I wasn't even supposed to be out that far. I just delivered a custom oven to a bed and breakfast that had forgotten to update their address. The new location was tucked somewhere near the Appalachian border, a solid 2 hours from where I was supposed to be. Around 6:20 p.m., the fog rolled in thick. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, when I saw what looked like a shoulder-wide path breaking away to the left with a wooden signpost. I couldn't read the sign through the mist, but I recognized that I'd been there before, maybe 5 years ago, on a camping trip with my brother and his college friends. There'd been a gravel road that led to an old state ranger cabin, which had been abandoned even back then. I remembered the gravel path continuing to a small clearing, where we'd parked our car and hiked another mile into the woods. I remembered that clearing having a decent spot to turn around, maybe even sleep in the van if I had to. I took the turn. The tires crackled over the gravel and the road seemed more overgrown than I remembered. Saplings had begun to reclaim the edges. The fog grew denser. It was too late to turn back. The road twisted and narrowed until it opened into that familiar clearing. Only now it looked different. The grass was overgrown and the tree line had drawn closer. It didn't feel like it had 5 years ago. It felt like the forest didn't want me there. I parked the van and killed the engine, rolling down the window just to listen. Rain pattered lightly on the roof. The silence was thick. No crickets, no wind, not even birds. I leaned back in the seat, trying to rest my eyes, thinking I'd wait out the fog. I must have drifted off, because I woke with a sharp knock on the van's side panel. I shot upright, heart hammering. My first thought was a ranger or maybe someone else needing help. But I didn't see anyone through the windshield. Another knock, 3 times, deliberate, like knuckles on metal, came from the rear door. I turned around fast and grabbed the flashlight under the driver's seat. My breath was coming quick now. The windows had fogged up from inside, but I could still see enough to tell that no one was standing back there. The van rocked slightly, like something had leaned against it, or maybe climbed in the back. I got out, circling to the rear cautiously, the flashlight beam cutting through the mist. I opened the back doors quickly. Nothing, just the equipment, straps and boxes, no sign of any animal, no marks in the dirt or gravel. Just as I started to feel foolish, I saw something that hadn't been there before. A child's handprint smeared on the inside of the glass window in the back door. The print was small, maybe the size of a 4-year-old's, with long fingers and an oddly narrow palm. The condensation around it had smeared, but the print itself was dry. I stepped back and scanned the clearing again. The van was parked where I'd left it, and the woods still pressed in too close. That was when I saw someone near the tree line, partially hidden behind a tree. Just a face, pale, watching. I called out, "You all right?" But there was no response. The face slowly moved behind the tree and disappeared. I started toward it, but by the time I got close, I saw nothing but leaves and shadow. No footprints, no broken branches, like they'd sunk into the ground. The flashlight flickered. I banged it once to keep it lit and turned back toward the van. Then I heard something. A laugh. A low, wet-sounding chuckle, like a child trying to mimic a grown man. It came from my left, then from the right. I froze. There were two voices now, whispering low, almost like they were playing a game. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like, "You see him? Don't let him go yet." Not yet. I ran back to the van, slammed the door, and locked it. The whispers stopped instantly. The fog outside had thickened into a heavy curtain. I couldn't see 10 feet past the headlights when I flicked them on. Then something moved in the beam. A figure, crouching low, too low, scuttled quickly from one side of the light to the other. I only saw it for a second, but its limbs were too long for its body. It moved like a spider. I threw the van in reverse and gunned it. The wheels spun in the gravel before catching, and I backed up wildly, nearly hitting a tree. I corrected and turned, flooring it down the road, praying I'd make it back to the main road. I drove for what felt like 30 minutes, but the path kept going in circles. I recognized the same downed log 3 separate times. The GPS on my phone was still dead, and the van's internal compass kept spinning, refusing to point north. The fog refused to let up. Eventually, I came around a bend and nearly drove into a woman standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes hard. The van skidded sideways and stopped only feet from her. She didn't flinch. She wore a pale yellow dress, soaked with rain. Her hair was black and hung over her face like it hadn't been washed in weeks. I leaned on the horn. No response. She slowly raised one arm and pointed behind me. I don't know why, but I looked. In the rearview mirror, something was sitting in the back seat. I couldn't make out the full shape, just eyes. Not like a person's. They glowed slightly, dull yellow, set wide apart, too far for a human skull. I turned around quickly. Nothing was there. When I turned back to the front, the woman was gone. I didn't care anymore if I hit trees or drove off a ledge. I stomped the gas and didn't let up. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I burst out of the fog and back onto a main road, Highway 23, just south of the county line. The fuel light had been on the entire time, but somehow the tank wasn't empty. At the gas station I found, the attendant told me there hadn't been a ranger cabin in Kings Hollow for over 20 years. It burned down in the early 2000s. The story, according to him, was that a park ranger went mad and took a group of campers hostage. Killed 2 of them before turning the gun on himself. Locals say the place was cursed long before that. There's even stories about children in the woods, though nobody ever finds their tracks. The van sat outside my house for 3 days after that. I refused to drive it again. I kept the back doors locked, but every morning I'd find the same handprint on the window. I'd wipe it off, and the next day, it would be there again. Only after I parked it at the company lot and asked to switch vehicles did it stop. Months later, I was helping my brother clean out the basement at our parents' place. He pulled out an old digital camera from that same camping trip we took to Kings Hollow years ago. Most of the photos were just of us goofing off, campfire shots, blurry hiking pics, beer cans. But one photo was different. It was taken at the edge of the clearing. In the far background, near the tree line, stood a figure in a pale yellow dress. Neither of us remembered seeing her there. Story the end.
Story number 15.
I used to work as a night janitor at a high school in northern Michigan, a small town called Harbor Creek. Population just over 3,000. Not a place you'd think anything truly strange would happen, but that's often where the worst things hide. I'd taken the job after moving back from Detroit to help my mother, who was recovering from surgery. It wasn't what I wanted to do with my life, but it paid enough and gave me time to check in on her during the day. The school was old, built in the early 1930s, and parts of it hadn't been renovated since the 70s. The basement especially looked like something out of an asylum. Low ceilings, exposed pipes, concrete floors that sloped oddly in places. Most of the night shift involved routine stuff: mopping hallways, vacuuming classrooms, restocking the bathrooms. But sometimes I had to go down into the basement to store equipment or retrieve cleaning chemicals. I hated those trips. Even before anything unusual happened, that place made me feel like I wasn't alone. There were rumors among the other janitors, especially the older ones who'd worked there for decades. They said weird things had always happened in the school, especially after hours. Shadows where there shouldn't be any. Sounds like children whispering in the empty auditorium. But we all have our stories, and I figured they were just passing time with ghost tales. Then I started noticing things myself. It began with the lights. I'd lock up classrooms at the far end of the west hallway, double-check the switches, and find them on again 10 minutes later. It happened too many times to chalk it up to forgetfulness. One night, I stood outside room 106, flicked the lights off, and waited. I walked down the hall slowly, turned the corner, and peered back. The lights flicked back on. No one inside. I checked. The next week, someone or something started moving my cart. I'd leave it parked outside a classroom, and when I came back, it would be several feet away, facing a different direction. I asked the other janitor on duty, Greg, if he was messing with me. He just looked at me with this exhausted expression and said, "You're just starting to notice. Took me 2 years." He told me about a student who had died in the gym back in the 1980s. A freak accident, a faulty rope in gym class. Kid broke his neck. Ever since then, strange things had been reported, mostly by night staff. One janitor even quit on the spot after hearing what he swore was someone calling his name from the locker room when the place was locked down. I still didn't want to believe it. Until the night I went down into the basement around 2 a.m. to get a replacement mop head. The storage area was in the farthest corner, near what used to be the boiler room. I carried a flashlight with me because half the bulbs in the basement flickered or didn't work. As I walked, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't a pipe creaking or water dripping. Those sounds are familiar and harmless. This was breathing. Shallow, ragged breathing, coming from just around the corner where the hallway turned sharply left. I stood still, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was an echo or some weird vent noise. But it kept going. Then I heard footsteps, bare, slow footsteps on concrete, not approaching, just pacing. I should have turned back, but I thought maybe someone had broken in. Homeless people sometimes took shelter in old buildings. I stepped forward and called out, "Hello? You're not supposed to be down here." The breathing stopped. I turned the corner quickly, flashlight pointed ahead. No one. Just the storage room door, slightly ajar, swaying like it had just been opened or closed. I approached slowly, heart in my throat. I pushed the door open all the way. The room was empty. Just shelves of buckets, cleaners, and some broken folding chairs. Nothing out of place. Then the light in the hallway behind me shut off. I froze. The switch was on the other side of the hallway. No timers, no motion sensors. I turned around and saw the pitch-black corridor stretching behind me. My flashlight flickered once, then came back on. Then I heard it. Whispers. Right next to my ear. I spun around so fast I nearly slipped. No one. I didn't grab the mop head. I sprinted up the stairs, heart slamming, flashlight beam swinging wildly as I went. When I got to the main floor, I locked the basement door and sat in the janitor's closet for 15 minutes, shaking. The rest of the week, I refused to go back down there. Greg covered the basement stuff, and I stuck to classrooms and hallways. But the whispers didn't stop. I'd be vacuuming alone and hear them again, faint murmurs like someone speaking just beyond my comprehension. Once I heard my name, clear as day, drawn out slowly. Daniel. That's when I started keeping my earbuds in, blasting music to drown it out. It helped, until I saw something. I was cleaning the science lab one night when I looked up at the observation window across the hallway. It was part of the old guidance office. No one used that part of the building anymore. But in the glass, I saw a figure. Tall, pale, wearing something that looked like a hospital gown. Its head was tilted to one side and its mouth was open. Just open. not moving. I turned around, expecting someone behind me. No one. When I looked back at the window, it was gone. I didn't tell anyone. I was afraid they'd think I'd lost it, but I started carrying my phone in my pocket, camera ready. I figured if it happened again, I'd get proof. I did, but I wish I hadn't. One Saturday night, I was doing a deep clean in the gym. No other staff on duty. I had music playing low from my phone and was scrubbing down the bleachers when the overhead lights dimmed, just slightly. I paused, looked up, and saw someone standing at the far end of the court. A boy, maybe 16 or 17, short hair, dressed in old-fashioned gym clothes, white tee, red shorts, high socks. His head was slightly down, like he was ashamed or sad. He didn't move. I pulled out my phone, started recording, and said, "Hey, are you okay?" He didn't respond. I took a step forward. He lifted his head, and I swear to God, he had no eyes, just dark, empty sockets. His mouth opened impossibly wide, and he let out a sound like metal scraping against metal. My phone shut off. The gym lights surged, then went out completely. I ran. The principal reviewed the footage from the security cams. The angle from the main hallway caught me entering the gym, then 3 minutes later, running out full speed. But inside the gym, the cameras cut out for 5 full minutes. Black screen. I told him what I saw. He didn't laugh. He just nodded slowly and said, "You're not the first." He showed me a file he kept locked in his office. Incidents reported by staff over the years, all after midnight. The boy in the gym, the pale man in the gown, the breathing in the basement. They matched perfectly. Some reports went back as far as 1979. I tried to quit, but they were short-staffed and offered me a raise. I was broke. My mom still needed help. So I stayed, but I stopped working alone. That was until 3 weeks before I finally left for good. I was mopping the way outside the art room when I heard a loud from inside. I figured something fell off a shelf, but when I opened the door, everything was still. I turned to leave and saw someone sitting in the back of the classroom. It was the boy again, head down, still. I didn't speak. I just slowly backed out and closed the door. Then came the knock. From the inside. 3 hard knocks. I opened the door again. Empty. Every stool neatly tucked in, every brush in place, not a single footprint on the dusty floor. I ran straight to Greg. He was in the cafeteria, and when I told him, his face went pale. He said, "You shouldn't have opened the door. They don't want you to acknowledge them." That was the last straw. I gave 2 weeks' notice, but I never showed up again. The school still stands. They've modernized parts of it, but not the basement. That's still the same cracked concrete and rusted pipes. A few months ago, I ran into Greg at a gas station. He looked thinner, worn down. We caught up briefly, and I asked if the weird stuff was still happening. He nodded and said, "Worse now. Ever since you left, it's like they noticed you, and now they're not hiding anymore." A few days later, I got a text from an unknown number. Just a photo. It was the hallway outside the art room, and standing there at the end of the hall was the boy, looking straight at the camera. Story the end.